Hi, welcome to another video on Vadi's guards. Please excuse the weird cycling gloves, there's a good reason for it. In this video, I'm going to talk about something I've teased a few times, which is parrying. And kind of which guard choices you use for parrying and how that affects things. And you know, it's kind of weird to say guard choices because, as I said before, they all kind of close a particular line of attack. And clearly, the guard you're going to choose to parry to is one that corresponds to that line of attack. But I think it's really important to think about parry slightly differently than just the defensive action. Now you see this time and time again in Vadi that parry is not just keeping you safe, that's its primary purpose, but it is also a setup for a counterattack, or perhaps indeed the counterattack in the same motion. Sometimes humorists refer to counterattack as just like attacking into an attack. I don't, in Vadi doesn't. In Vadi, the counterattack is just whatever you've done after you've defended against an attack or while you are defending against an attack. A parry is a riposte is a counterattack in this context. So as I've touched upon in the previous videos, any guard can be used to parry, right? The most obvious ones, the ones that come up more than anything else, middle guards, right? And as I said with middle guards, right, you know, they're all setting up. The point up guards are really good for kind of covering middle and above. The point down guards are kind of good for covering middle and below, right? Not the legs, but rising ones to the hands or rising ones to the body in particular. And this is one of the areas that it's very easy to see kind of the differences, right? Because these, as I said in the previous video, yes, they're parry in the middle, but they're also giving you lots and lots of different counterattack options. These are largely parrying below and really only charging the thrust or maybe a quick rising strike to the head, right? Is another option that comes quite naturally from them. Other ones, not so much. Now, with those, the choice is pretty obvious for doing a defense and then counter, in the sense that it's determined by what you're trying to defend, right? Yeah, I guess for kind of a horizontal cut to here, I could probably parry it that way. I could probably parry it that way. I generally find anything low or rising, you really want to use the point forward guards because it brings the cross guard into effect. So you've got a bigger margin of error, in which case you then determine what is your response, because you've chosen the guard for the cut. But again, sticking with middle guards, right, the counter thrust is the thing, right? Cut's coming in, dunk, in the face. And you know, that is an option you might want to pursue in terms of a defensive option. I will talk about tempo probably in the future video after I'm done with talking about guards. It's the next natural, obvious thing to talk about. But in short, you know, if you are defending and then counterattacking, you're giving your opponent more opportunity to react than if you are defending and counterattacking, right? At the same time, that counter thrust, right, when successful, more effective, harder to pull off. So if I'm trying to do a choice, again, we're talking about choices, parries, right? If I don't have a lot of time to react, this is a better default, right? Because I'm safe, I'm coming back in. If my opponent's starting a bit too far away, or they're really telegraphing their thing, or their cut is too big, or anything like that, that's when I've got the option to think, oh, okay, I've got enough time, I've got enough space, I'm going to come in with a counter thrust and do a counter thrust to it. And of course, you've got this long to decide which one is the correct one, so good luck with that. There's no doubt about it that decision making can be hard, and we make the wrong decision quite often, which is why one of the main reasons why doubles happen. But the other guards, right? The other guards are all good counterattacks, and sorry, good defensive options. And starting with kind of covering the head, as I've said in the high guard video, these, right, very nice high strike covers. Even more than this, right, this relies this strike to genuinely be a descending cut to the head. Right, you've got a bit more of a margin of error with this. If someone is doing a rising strike and I do this, I'm just going to eat a blow to the arms. But A, it's a stronger parry. So particularly if I'm fencing a brute or someone who is 2 feet taller than me, and definitely kind of coming down on top, I might want to do this because I've got this too low, and if a particularly strong strike, if I'm catching the parry here and they're much bigger than me, there's a risk of it kind of coming through the parry. Whereas this, there really isn't. My only risk is that I've punched their sword rather than defended against it. Likewise this. These also set up a better low line counter. Okay, if you've got the line of attack for a thrust, by all means take it, right? But it's possible that you kind of come too wide or something like that. Because you're much higher, I like this one, right? I honestly, if you parried here, they are basically impossible for them to get to that low moment in time, come straight back up, right? When I talk about tempo and mezzo tempo, half tempo, I'll explain the edge alignment to that, but for both of those I use the false edge. Just accept it. We'll talk about it later. I'll explain why. Other ones though, perfectly possible here, right? This is an option, likewise. This is an option. The one to your dominant side is stronger than the one to your weak side, always, on that particular one, but you can do both. And a little depend on what your opponent's expecting. If they are right-handed, this side will be harder for them to defend, so that's kind of an offset within that. And as I say, the main reason to opt for those over something else is if you're fencing somebody who's much taller than you, right? Both because their strike is more likely to be coming down in on top, but also you need that stronger parry to make sure you've got the structure to block against it and you're not getting kind of parried through. Also, right, thrusts. Don't forget the thruster thing, right? This motion, if you keep doing this against the thrust, especially without step, you might often find you're kind of getting bound up in it. Much bigger motion to kind of come up, push the thrust away, all right? And again, thrusts, generally speaking, people who are good at thrusts come in pretty strongly and you need a lot of force to displace them. I pretty much always step out to try and defend a thrust, or rather, when I don't, I get hit. So I would advise you to, but especially, the higher guards coming up will give you a better kind of resistance against the thrust than just kind of coming to one of these positions. Counter thrusts against thrusts also, of course, an option. Now that brings me, those are the obvious ones, right? I'm kind of getting less and less obvious. Let's talk about falcon. As I said in the high guards video, this is probably my most controversial opinion in my club. But I really like the falcon parry, right? It is very specific circumstances is the problem, right? Where the falcon parry comes up. But in those circumstances, it's great, both in terms of defending something which is quite hard to defend and setting up some quite interesting counterattacks. So pretty much the only thing the falcon parry covers is a cut kind of coming here. You can, I guess, do something like that and cover a bit more, right? But generally speaking, we're covering something like this, right? Top of the head. 9 times out of 10, when I'm doing a falcon parry, it's the same thing. It's this, right? I showed this earlier, right? I've parried here, I've cut here, right? It's this low line cut where the falcon parry really excels. If the sword is on this side, it's no good. I want to come to that. But particularly if they've tried and failed to parry this low line cut to this target, what's most likely to happen is they're going to be coming over the top of my sword, right? And while in theory you can kind of push the sword across like this, again, this is happening very fast. The most likely result of here come across is I just eat the sword, this part of my face rather than this part of my face, right? I just push it into my head. The falcon parry is nice because it's a quick snap up, right? Covers you, normally with an exit, right? Sabreurs who are watching this will recognize high 8 or high 7, depending on the system you study, which I also love and I also use in pretty much exactly the same circumstances. Quick flash up, cover the high line after a low line attack to that side. The other circumstance the falcon parry comes up, well, there's 2 others. for me. One is, I like this one, just come to it, right? If someone's attacking here. The other one for me is cut and avoid, chased in, come in again. I'll show a couple clips of those as well. In all cases, right, what it is you're quickly throwing up a defense to a highline strike. It's not one that I would ever use, for instance, if I was kind of here, they were coming in, I wouldn't try and block it like this, because those circumstances you would use a rising beat, which I talked about in the low guard video, which is more effective, I think, in those cases. But particularly when you kind of your sword's kind of stuck on the body from these low line strikes, it's very difficult to get the percussive force required for that beat, and you're much closer, so the timing is much harder to get. Hence this, which is blocking it rather than deflecting it. So the other reason I like the falcon parry is it charges things really nicely, right? You know, especially if you're cutting here, the sword tends to cut out of the weak, and it really charges, cuts to the other side. Or one of my favorite ones, charges here. I've done a low line strike, parried the falcon, done another low line strike, right? It becomes quite a nice little pattern to do that, because they're expecting a cut coming to some other direction. Now, the legs, right? I've talked about kind of waist up, hands, legs, etc. So hands and body and head, the legs. You absolutely can parry cuts to the leg using the low guards, right? They're all covering something, right? Either left or the right. It works, 100% works. If you're in a low guard and they cut the leg, maybe you want to do it. If you're in a mid guard and they cut the leg, particularly point forward guard, maybe you want to do it. You see that a lot in saber sources and side sword sources. Don't hit your hip in the owl. So you do see that in other systems. You don't necessarily see it explicitly in Vadi. Pagano, which is Napoleon text. I don't think Pagano was from Naples, but that's where it was published. He describes, it's not a very detailed source, but he describes a sparring match between two of his students, and they are frequently doing parries to the leg, right? And I think the Vadi guards work perfectly for it. When I first read the passage, that was my first thought. The problem with parries to the leg is that the counterattack is very poorly set up. So while you can do it, right, there's not a lot of great options. Like, you can kind of come up with a thrust, but basically every counterattack option you have doesn't really deal with the sword, right? You've deflected the sword, you come back up. So I think where this comes up more for me, kind of long distance one arm strikes, it's great because once you've deflected the sword there, if they're in their one hand, like, their recovery is much harder, so you don't need to worry so much about the sword. As well as that, the main defense for the sword that most people, for leg strikes that most people use, is a leg slip, right? Void of some kind, just don't be there. Again, not in Vadi, but is in Furies and lots of other systems. Perfectly valid way of defending. And again, against that, Geishlin, right, which has a lot of reach, the leg slip is much harder. So that's one of the circumstances where I think a leg parry is a good option, if you can pull it off. But for the most part, I would avoid doing direct leg parries, because actually the void is just better and charges whatever counter attack you want, rather than you kind of being all the way down here and then having awkward strikes up and that kind of stuff. So wrap all that up, right? Every guard can be used for parry. Which guard you choose to use for parry will depend a bit on what your opponent is doing, but also a bit about what you want to set up next. And they do set up different things. They do come to different crossings, and they are useful in different circumstances. Leg parries are the least useful because a void is much more straightforward for the leg by just flipping it. And the counterattacks it sets up are much worse. And of course, the point forward parries are the ones that you can use if you want to set up a counterattack in the same moment as the defense with a counter thrust. Thanks for watching. And I've got one last video on guards to shoot, which is on kind of bringing all this together and sort of choosing which guard and sort of what considerations you need to bring into place when you're deciding what to do against an opponent.